All right, so we are painting this little guy today. I've already drawn him out, tried to get the face as long as possible. I think this is a greyhound puppy. So we've got his face all drawn out. I already have all my values in with my graphite. So all I'm doing today is laying color on top of a drawing that's sort of already finished and already established. So I'm going to just be talking about the colors of his fur here. We're probably going to get a little bit of the blanket he's sitting on, this sort of dark teal, and then the sort of very pale blue in the background. So we're going to start with the background colors so that starts to dry a little bit quicker. For the background, I'm going to use a number 10 brush just so that I can cover a lot of space all at once. When you're coloring, this is when you can start to do some sort of subtractive artistic license. I'm going to get rid of sort of these big chunky things in the background and just have maybe a gradient of like light blue to dark blue going on in the background, just so that he or she remains the focus and we're not looking at all kinds of stuff back here. Okay, so I'm going to mix. I have a little bit of green already in my palette here. So I'm going to rehydrate that color, and then I'm going to add some blue. I'm working with cobalt blue here. And I'm going to dilute it a lot because I don't want this background to be dark at all. What else can help is you can dilute your paints in your palette here, but you can also, I'm going to come in with clear water and wet the background so that once I do put color down, it starts to spread instantly, which will dilute that color even further. So just be careful around the boundaries of your subject matter here. You can't really tell because of my camera, but I only have tape on the top and bottom of this one. This is a commission and they need it to be 8 by 10. And this paper is exactly 8 across. So I don't want to have that little white margin that having the tape there would create, which when you're watercoloring is a little tough because this paper is going to warp a bit just because there's no tape on the sides. So we're just going to try to stay conscious of any water that might be pooling because the paper might make some waves as it's getting wet. So if you do have any water sort of pooling together, always have tissues on hand. I have a roll of toilet paper that will help me soak up any extra water. I also have Q-tips that can help do that sort of in a more detailed, smaller area. So just have things on hand that can help you sort of control that flow of color. So here I have my very, very light blue. I'm going to start on this side with the blue, and then I'm going to try to make it just a tad darker as I move over to the other side. So I'm going to have this color going all the way to the edge. And I'm trying to, I've already painted clear water onto the background, so this water is going to be pretty easy to blend. But just sort of my instinct, I guess, is to paint this color on in lots of different directions so that my brush strokes are sort of hidden. So I'm sort of doing some cross hatching just to get the color down and to make sure you can't see any brush strokes. Okay, so I'm going to make my blue just a little bit darker around the center here. And then I'll make it even darker once I get to the edge. If you want to use a smaller brush, once you get closer to your focal point here, you can do that. I'm not super concerned about getting color onto him or onto our greyhound here because I'm going to come over with more colors. So, and this is pretty diluted. I would be more concerned maybe on this side once your color's darker that you don't get that color onto your little buddy here. Okay, so you have a gradual gradient from light blue to a little bit darker. And since your paper was wet, that color very easily is blending into each other, into the paper. And that should dry fairly quickly. So what I'm going to do while that is drying is come down here with this sort of dark teal color in his blanket. We don't see a lot of that blanket, but because colors reflect, you know, he's going to have a little bit of an indication of that dark teal sort of in the bottom carriage here. So I want that color to sort of seep into his fur, the color of his fur, just a little bit. So I'm going to treat this like I would a shadow, where the shadow color is going to be this dark teal, and then we'll layer on top of that shadow color with the actual color of his fur. So I want this color to be very dramatically different from the blue that we've painted on the wall. A deeper, more saturated color is gonna feel like it's closer to the viewer than a faded out color here. Sort of one of the rules of painting is things get clearer and more intense color-wise the closer they are to the viewer, and as things are further away, they get blurrier and lighter. So always keep that in mind, so that your painting has a very strong sense of depth to it. Okay, so always look at your reference photo here. I mean, you can play around with some artistic license and put colors in extra places, but since this is a commission and I was given this photo specifically, we want to try and keep it as accurate as possible. So this is the little space between our doggo's legs, front legs. And then we have a little bit here. I'm going to leave a little bit of a white ridge on the top of some of this fabric. You can see there's a highlight right around the peak of that. So I want to leave some highlight. We can come back in and sort of dull that down a little bit, since the highlight isn't a bright white, it's just a lighter version of this color. But for right now, with watercolors, you get the shadows by layering. So we'll come back over these very light areas with a couple more layers of this color, just to make sure that it has that sort of feel of a highlight. I'm going to do the same. Oh, she couldn't see what I was painting. So here we have a little ridge of white right on the sort of peaks of where this fabric is folding. And then we're going to come back in using layers of this same color to sort of build up the shadows. And we have just a little bit back here as well. So this little bit of blanket, that's probably the only layer that one will get, whereas we'll layer more down here so that the color is more intense. I'm actually going to come in with a little bit of tissue, sop up some of that green just so that it's not as intense. Okay, and then like what I was saying before about introducing this blanket color into sort of the shadows of our dog here. So what I'm going to do is where I've already sort of plotted out where my shadows are going to go, I want to put just a very diluted version of this green into where the sort of deepest shadows of our dog is. So right under the leg here, there's a pretty intense shadow. You can see here. And then this leg is casting a shadow onto the body. We have some pretty deep shadows in the chest here and right under the muzzle. So that's where I'm going to go in with this very diluted version of this green, just to make sure that our shadows have a little bit of a cooler tint than the fur. That'll make those shadows and the contrast of our doggy here really, really stand out. And it'll also make it feel like this dog is really resting on this dark teal blanket if some of that color is being reflected into the fur. This little dog tag is casting a shadow, so we want to put that in. And again, his muzzle is casting a shadow onto his neck. And this is probably where I would start using a smaller brush. I was using a number 10. I'm going to switch to a number 6 for the shadows in the face. I'm even going to go in with that shadow color this is just the base layer of all our shadows. We're going to build on top of every single one of these spaces. So I want to get that sort of underlying cool tone down on the nose and the eyes and any other really dark area up here in the face. Probably going to cast a little bit of a shadow on the collar. Then we have a lot of like creases in the ear where the ear will be sort of casting shadows onto itself. I want to fill in a little bit of that. And I'm not getting too detailed right now. I got detailed with the pencil while I was drawing. Now we're just sort of filling in those sort of larger areas where they're dark in the pencil drawing. Again, these areas are going to get a lot of layers to build up these colors. I'm going to fill in the eye, leaving the sort of white highlights. The goal here is to keep those white highlights white and just sort of paint around them, or else you need to come back with like white acrylic paint to sort of reinforce those highlights. So one thing you have to really pay attention to when you're watercoloring is to leave the highlights, really plan out where those highlights are going to be so that you don't paint over them. so that all these highlights remain the white of the paper and you don't have to come back in with paint to paint on top. And then again, if you have a little bit too much water color mixture on your paintbrush, you can always just go in with a tissue, pick up some of it. This will also just help your painting dry a little bit faster so that you can come back in with the next layer. One of the key things about watercolor as well is when you're building up all these layers of shadow and then midtone, you really have to wait for each layer to dry before you do the next one, or else everything's going to become muddy. You're not going to get shadows versus highlights versus midtones. You're just your whole painting's just going to be a big midtone. Okay, so I'm going to paint a couple more little areas of shadow here. Get a little bit more down here. I think this front leg has some shadow. And this shadow on the leg will really help the highlight on the fabric here. It would really help that pop. Okay, then we got a couple of shadows in the leg. And you can really play around with how much pressure you're putting on your paintbrush. If you feel comfortable just using the tip and sort of moving paint around that way, that's fine. Or you can really start to use like the side of your paintbrush so that you get sort of these big sweeping brush strokes. It'll depend on your subject matter, obviously. I can't do big, bold brush strokes in his face, but once I come down to the body where there's a lot of space, that's when you can start to use the side of your paintbrush and cover a lot more area at once. Okay. And if your reference photo, when we talk about light source, because when you're painting shadows, that means there's a strong light source somewhere that is creating those shadows. When you get a commission to paint from a photograph, sometimes that light source is a little bit confusing. It can be the flash of the camera, or there could be multiple light sources, like maybe there's a window that's bringing in light, which clearly there's a window over here because this side of his face is in highlight. There's a highlight right on this sort of edge of his shoulder. There's a highlight right here on his hind leg. But then maybe there's an overhead light on as well. That's why the top of his head seems like it's in light. So you know, it's sort of up to your creative license to paint exactly how you see it. Or if you want to create one light source for this painting, so that it's sort of easier to determine, you know, where that one light source is. That's sort of up to you. I'm going to try and paint this as I see it. But it could get confusing if there's like way too many light sources, especially if you're trying to paint strong shadows. That would indicate that there's one or two strong light sources. Okay, so I'm going to blur the edge of that shadow just a teeny bit. Okay, so I'm going to let this dry for a bit before I start coming in with this sort of like tan orangey fur color. Maybe I'll make a little bit more shadow on his muzzle here. Again, this is just going to be layered on top of, but I want that to look a little bit more blurred into the skin. Okay, so I'm going to let this dry for a little bit. Okay, this has been drying for about 20 minutes-ish. The eyes are still a little wet, but we're not focusing on the eyes right now. We're going to focus on the color of our fur here. So while we're doing that, the eyes will dry a little bit more. So what I have here is a mixture of burnt umber, a lot of light yellow hue, and just a little bit of white, just to make it a little bit more opaque and a little bit softer of a color. I think for this dog in particular, I'm going to add a little bit more yellow, and the tones are going to change a little bit. Like up in his face here, this seems a little bit more yellow than down here. Down here maybe feels a little bit more red. So you're not going to use the same exact color all over the body here. So just be conscious of that, and don't be afraid of sort of mixing in, more yellows, more reds, more burnt umbers, just to change this color up a little bit. So I'm going to add a little bit more yellow for the face here. I'm going to try and keep this sort of right next to the face so that you can see exactly what I'm trying to do. And this might require, again, a few coats. But what I'm doing here is just trying to figure out where his fur gets warm, right? So I want to layer this warm color on top of some of those cool areas. But then if you notice, there's areas in his face that are still pretty white, like right above the eyes, along the cheeks here, and then the muzzle doesn't have any of this sort of tan color at all. So we want to make sure we spread this color around intentionally where we see that sort of warm color. So I'm going to leave this area right above the eyes untouched. We come around the forehead, has all of that color. This warm color does sort of go near the bottom of the eye, but not quite. There is some along this cheek here. Again, there's a big part of the upper eye socket that doesn't have any of this color. And I'm going to come back in with just clear water to sort of blur out the edge of this tan color. Just so that there's a smooth, because there's no hard lines, at least between the differences of color in his fur. There's no hard lines like this. So we'll come back in with clear water to blend those in. I do want to come down to his nose with this color, just because that we're just adding another layer that will make that sort of really darkness of his nose is going to require a lot of layers. So I am gonna come in with this color right on top. All right, and so before this color dries, I'm gonna come in with my clear water and help blur that white fur into the tan fur as best I can. This might also warrant bringing in a Q-tip to really help blur those lines a little bit. So here I have little Q-tip. So I'm going to make sure the boundary between the white of the paper and this tan color is really blended in. And sometimes blending just means taking some color off before it dries. Do some down here as well. And you can use a Q-tip, just sort of dab, or you can go in there and actually draw with the Q-tip a little bit. It'll be soaking up some water while it's moving that color around. Okay, so for the body, I'm going to put a little bit more red into this fur color, because I feel like over here, and maybe it's because the light source, the window over here, the fur gets a little bit more red than it did up here. The top of his forehead seems a little bit more red, at least than what it was down in the muzzle. So I've added a little bit of red to this. I'm going to come in to the forehead and put that slightly more redder color up here. And if that's too intense of a color, you can come back in with a tissue and lift off some of that. Since this area is already wet with that first layer of fur color you put in, that color will blend in pretty seamlessly once you sort of let it start drying. I'm going to come in with some clear water just to make sure that color moves around a little bit more. Okay, so yeah, that makes the top of his head feel a little bit warmer than I had it before. All right, and then over here, since we do have sort of a strong highlight on the edge of his shoulder here, I'm going to leave that area white for now. And then I'm just going to come in with this fur color and sort of layer on top of those shadows that I've already put there. Again, this is going to require a lot of layers. So if I leave this white right now and I put a couple of layers of color down here, once I do lay some pigment along the edge of this shoulder, it's going to be a lot lighter than what's over here. So you'll see that sort of evolve as we put down more layers, wait for them to dry, and then put more layers. So right under the collar here, it's pretty light, so I'm going to leave that white for now and then just sort of paint the area around it. Again, I'm going to layer over all the shadows we've already painted down here, because those shadows are laying on top of this fur color. With watercolor, you sort of work backwards, so that's why I put shadows first, so that I don't have to think about the shadows anymore. At this point, I'm just layering on the actual color of our dog, and those shadows are already there. So this whole side of the body, I think there's maybe a little areas that are lighter, like sort of in the folds. You have like that shadow of a fold, and then it's sort of lighter on each side. So I'm going to leave a couple spaces back here, the white of the paper, just until I can figure out, or I can get more layers of color down in the body. I'm also going to leave a slight highlight on this side of his shoulder, just because in the reference photo, the shoulder seems a little bit lighter than sort of the back here. So I'm going to leave that little sliver. And then I'm going to do the same sort of on his leg, like where the knuckles are, or his joint here has a bit of highlight on the top. So I'm going to leave that highlight, but then paint the rest of his arm, layering on top of that shadow. There's also a little highlight sort of in the folds of the skin of his arm, so I'm going to leave that white for now. All right, and then the back, because it gets a little blurry, his back gets a little blurry compared to the face, at least. The face is what we want to be sort of the sharpest, the most in focus, and the body tends to be a little bit fuzzier. So this is, this being in focus and this being fuzzy was sort of the work of the photographer here. So when we're recreating this in a painting, it gets a little bit trickier. So I'm going to come in with this body color, and there's not a lot of highlight in this section except for a slight highlight right around the edge, again because our light source is coming over here. There's going to be a little rim of reflected light on the top here, so I'm going to leave just a tiny bit, probably like 1/8 of an inch of a highlight up there. And then everything else back here I'm going to fill in, because again, this area is facing away from the light, so this is mostly going to be in shadow. And when you're layering on top of an area that you've already painted a shadow on, I wouldn't go over that area too much, or else you're going to bring up that shadow color and it's going to mix with the mid-tone color that you're using. Again, if you wait for this to dry completely, the shadow layer, if you wait for the shadow layer to dry completely and then come on top with your mid-tones, usually that shadow color isn't going to move much, but if you keep going over it with your mid-tone color, then it'll all mix together, and you'll sort of lose your shadow. So I'm going to try and leave that area alone because I feel like some of that blue is coming up and I don't want it to anymore. So I'm going to leave that alone for now. And then I'm going to come in, I'm going to create a sort of a different color for the leg. I'm going to add a little bit more yellow back to it, and then a little bit more burnt umber so that it's a little bit browner, so that it looks like it's sort of farther away from the light source and it's sort of on a different plane than the back here. So there's a couple key highlights on the leg that we want to leave the white of the paper. So again, just like the back had a little bit of reflected light, so does sort of this curve of the leg. And then, I don't know what you call this part of I don't know if that's the knee or the thigh, whatever. There's a highlight right on the tip of this hind leg that we're going to leave the white of the paper so that highlight really bounces up to the viewer. And then we're just going to paint in the rest of the leg. Because of the graphite work that's already down and the shadow layer that's already down, and plus we don't want this leg to be as detailed as the face. So this is about all the detail we want in there. There's a couple of shadows, and then the color of the fur. And we might come in here with a couple more shadows just to really show the difference between like the leg and then like the body that's sort of in this little space here. But for the most part, this is kind of all we're gonna do with the leg. I'm also gonna come in this little spot that had sort of that deep shadow. That's still part of the dog, so I'm gonna put this mid-tone color on there just to build up the depth of the color of that shadow. I'm gonna leave just a little bit of a highlight under the leg. There's not a very strong highlight under here, but again, it might just be because the fur is a different color. Maybe this is white fur, just like there's white fur in the face. So there needs to be a teeny bit of a highlight down here. And then we can sort of finish up with the legs. I'm gonna leave a tiny bit of a highlight right on the little toes here. Again, that might be because the fur on the toes are white. It's sort of hard to see in the reference photo here. I mean, this area is a little bit lighter than the leg. And I think actually the tail is also sort of curled in with the sort of bundle here. But we're gonna leave the toes just a little bit lighter than everything else. Okay. So what happens now, while that mid-tone is drying, I'm going to come into the ears. The ears don't have like a lot of color. They just sort of seem like a bunch of different kinds of grays and maybe slightly pink just because the skin is so the fur is so thin up here. So I'm going to come in with a little bit of the skin tone. I'll probably not do a whole lot else to the ears except maybe some grays and some pinks. But adding this mid-tone color, even if it doesn't super show up in your reference photo, having this sort of same color just makes the ears feel like they're attached to the dog rather than being completely different colors. So again, this is some artistic license. There's not a lot of fur, obviously, on the inside of ears, but we want to make it feel like it all comes together. Okay, so while all that's drying, I'm going to come back into the blanket that our dog is sitting on for another layer to sort of intensify this color a little bit. And we can use that also to intensify the shadows in the dog. I'm actually going to make this a slightly different color. I'm going to add a little bit more blue, maybe a little bit of burnt umber just to make it a little darker. And then we can come in and put another layer of shadows. I'm going to bring that shadow into the body. As you can see in the reference photo, it sort of gets really blurred what's blanket and then where the body of the dog starts. So I want to recreate that here by sort of layering on top of that sort of border between the body and the blanket. That'll make that boundary a little bit more less obvious. And it'll really make our dog feel like he's really resting on top of this blanket. I'm going to come in with a couple of shadows down in the blanket part here. And again, this is all in an effort to layer. Eventually, these really strong white highlights of the blanket will be sort of pushed down by using somewhat the same color we're using here, but we just want to get our shadows and our midtones figured out first before we start filling in the highlights. And you can also put a little bit more of that color back into the shadows. With watercolor, it's sort of a constant push or pull because every layer we paint down is pretty transparent. If you do get to the point where in your painting you want an area that's so dark you can't see through it anymore, that's just going to require a bunch of layers. So that is what we're working on now, that sort of push and pull between shadow. You put midtones on top of the shadow. You want to make the shadows more intense, so you go back in with your shadow colors. So it's a constant push and pull. Don't be afraid if you lose an area. You can always come back and sort of reinforce the contrast or certain lines that you may lose because of all that layering. One thing I forgot to do with the fur tone is the neck here. The neck seems to be pretty warm with this fur color, and because of that, that makes the snout, which is white around the mouth. If the neck is this warm color, it's really going to make that mouth really come forward. So I'm going to fill that in real quick. Okay, so now I'm going back in and trying to reinforce some of that shadow, because next, after I reinforce this sort of cool shadow color, I'm going to come back in with another layer of this fur color to help sort of make those colors a little bit brighter, a little bit more saturated. And your shadows can also sort of help define these little shapes that you haven't directly painted yet. This is sort of a negative painting where I'm painting around the dog tag here. And then eventually we'll get to the point where we paint in sort of the yellowish gold color of this dog tag. Okay, and I think I need a little bit of this blanket color back here as well, like this area here, and that will help really make the light bouncing off of his shoulder here really pop. Okay, so you can sort of see, I know it's been, maybe I've painted on this for about an hour, but you can really start to see the depth of this painting and just sort of all the sort of crevices that cast shadows on his body. It's really creating some beautiful areas here. So I'm going to come in here and paint the fur color. I'm going to really dilute it here though, because it doesn't get super dark right here. And this is also a good time, I think, to start to fill in some of those areas that maybe don't have really strong highlights, like the edge here, but are lighter than sort of the areas around it. So if you just come in with a really, really diluted version of the color of the fur and cover up some of these areas that you've left white, they're still going to read as kind of muted highlights just because they're lighter than everything around it, but they're not going to read as like a direct highlight like over here. So I'm going to do that to the toes down here. I did it to the arm, not all of it. I think this joint is getting some direct highlight, so I'm going to leave that white. This little part of the leg here is getting direct highlight, but maybe like the side of this face, since it's faced away from the light source, I'm going to fill that in with just a little bit of that fur color, not a lot, and I'm not going to bring it down to the mouth because that seems like white fur, whether it was white fur originally or maybe the dog's getting a little bit old, and that's sort of where white hair starts, or I guess gray hair on a dog starts to pop up right around the mouth. So I'm going to leave that white, but this will help sort of reinforce that the light source is on this side. I'm gonna mix up like a purple for the collar here. And I don't want the collar to be as an intense of a color of like the nose or the eyes. So I'm gonna make a purple, but I'm gonna dilute it. I'm not gonna make it as dark as it is in the photograph. Again, just because it's so that it doesn't become the focal point. I want the face to remain the focal point. But just to have this area filled in so that it doesn't look unfinished. Okay. All right. So what I want to do now is I think the nose and the eyes have dried. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with sort of a mixture of burnt umber and like a purpley, like I have Alizarian crimson, which is a red that sort of leans a little bit purple. I'm going to come in and layer that mixture of burnt umber and Alizarian crimson on top of the nose and the eyes. Having that warm color will sort of offset the cool, of the blues of the shadow color that we've used. And again, these areas are the nose and the eye area we're gonna require a lot of layering. So as long as you're sort of alternating cool colors with warm colors, then you'll get an overall general feeling of a really dark brown or a really dark gray if you keep alternating those layers. Because right now the nose is reading pretty warm compared to the portrait. Like the portrait it's black, but it's really hard to get true black in watercolor unless you use black out of the tube, which is something that is discouraged. You try to figure out how to create the darkest color imaginable just by using actual colors. So right now, the nose is reading a little bit warm, brown instead of like a cool dark gray. So again, we're going to build up to that by doing multiple layers of cool versus warm. So I'm going to come in with that burnt umber / Alizarian crimson color and layer that on top of the eyes. And maybe the video is sort of capturing this, and it does look pretty black, but in real life, it's just sort of reading as purple right now. So that'll change with the more layers we do. I'm gonna use this same color in the ears as well, because we want to get a little bit more depth in the ears. There's a lot of sort of folds and creases in the ears. So we want to get a few more colors in here just to sort of reinforce that depth. All right. But then you can sort of see, when you look at your reference photo, nothing in the photo is darker than the eyes and the nose and maybe the collar. But since we want our focus on the face, we're going to make our collar a little bit more diluted. And the eyes and the nose is what is going to get the most layers. So everything else, I'm sort of cool with the sort of contrast of everything. But what I want to do now is sort of come in with another mid-tone layer, just so that things are a little bit less transparent, and we can sort of hide some brush strokes that we can still sort of see. Also, because this was a fully sketched out portrait, like I had all my pencil marks, and I had even shaded with pencil as well. A lot of that is still going to show up. Maybe at the end of the video, I'll post a still so that you can see sort of close up, at least on the face close up, how much of that pencil you can still see, which I personally really like. I can see. I think I like it because I can see how the artist draws, how they work. Maybe even sometimes there's an indication of how they layered paint on top of that pencil. So I personally really like seeing all the pencil. So don't be afraid that you can still see that. Sometimes you want to paint something and lose the pencil under the paint, which is really hard to do with watercolor because everything's so transparent. But if you're not afraid of showing that pencil, I would encourage fully drawing everything out, shading in your shadows, leaving areas of highlight, and then just layer that paint on top of it. Okay, so I'm going to mix more of this fur color. I'm going to start with burnt umber. Add my yellow, my light yellow hue. I'm going to add just a touch of Grumbacher red just to warm it up a little bit. And then I do have some white I'm going to use. Just like black, it's sort of, you're discouraged from using white out of the tube. But I find using that white is the only way for me to get that like really sort of creamier feel to the color, if that makes sense. It also makes the color a little bit more opaque. So maybe you can get away with like one or two less layers because you used white, and that'll make the paint a little less see-through. Okay, so I'm gonna come in, I'm gonna start over here, and then just paint another layer on top of what you already have. You can even sort of branch out. If your highlight sort of shape isn't quite right, you can use this layer to really make things a little bit more accurate, a little bit more specific. So I'm actually going to cover up like the little highlight I had left down here. I'm going to cover that up with this layer just so that it still feels like a highlight, but it's not bright white. And I'm going to do that in a couple places. I'm going to even decrease the size of the white highlight that is sort of flowing across his back. This sort of highlight that I had left on this side, I'm going to cover that up just so that it still feels lighter than everything else around it, but it doesn't feel like a direct highlight. I'm going to use this color to sort of come down the entire torso area. I'm layering this on top of sort of the shadow color that I put down here to sort of reinforce that shadow. Just so that it feels a little fuzzier. It doesn't feel as sharp. Again, because we want everything sharp to be in the face. I'm going to come in and make sure this sort of chest area feels like it's sort of as dark as possible, but still showing a couple of the, just different angles and ridges. I'm going to cover up that shadow just so that it dulls it down just a little bit. And then I'm going to sort of decrease the size of the shadow along the edge of his shoulder, just so that it feels like he's facing away from the light source. And only the very edge is being affected by it. And you can already see how this layer is already creating so many different values and colors down here. And sort of reinforcing some of the structure of the dog itself. Like this little highlight here sort of helps you visualize and reinforce that, like, the bone underneath the skin. So just having those really delicate shifts of like a lighter midtone and then a darker midtone. Like this isn't quite a shadow or a highlight, but it's a difference of, a more diluted color next to maybe a brush stroke that didn't dilute as much. So just that subtle shift between light and darker can show off that, like, oh, maybe there's a bone underneath the fur. All right, so he still has some pretty strong highlights on his joints here, but maybe I'll just decrease the size of that highlight just a little bit. Again, we're working back to up. We're working dark from the darkest dark to the lightest light. So, as you're building these layers, these highlight shapes remain pretty big until you're on your very last layer and you want to define those highlight shapes a little bit more. I'm going to come back into the top of the head, just make sure that all the sort of shadows that should be happening on his head are in there. And always, if you want to blur the lines between, you know, a darker color and a lighter color. Always come back in with clear water. You can really blend everything together. And if you put too much down, come back in with a tissue, soak it up. A lot of that color will sort of stay where you put it, but all that excess will go away. Okay, so what's sort of happening in the muzzle now is I want to create a more of a gray. You know, a lot of this sort of tan color doesn't really come down into his muzzle all that much. It sort of turns gray. So you can create a gray, which is what I do is burnt umber mixed with a little bit of blue, cobalt, and then a little bit of red, whatever red you have. And that should make a gray, maybe not a neutral gray. You might have to play around a little bit with, maybe you need to put a little bit more green, put some orange in there. Basically, gray is just a mixture of all your colors. So mix it until you get a color that feels right. So I'm going to come in around the eyes with sort of more of a gray color. And sort of fill in all these little spaces like in the corners of the eyes where there's a lot of fur but not a lot of color. And come in and fill those areas in. There's also a lot of muscles in the face, so there's going to be a lot of little tiny subtle shadows where just, you know, the muscles are turning or facing different ways. And then, like I said, for the ears, once things sort of dry in the ears, I'll come back in with some grays and some pinks. And then you can use your tissue. I'm going to use my tissue to pick up a little bit of what I just put down, just because I want everything there to be sort of subtle. Okay, so for the pink in the ears, I'm going to start with some Grumbacher red. And really all you need to do to get a good pink is just really dilute that Grumbacher red until it starts reading like a pink. And then I'm just going to come into the ears. Here, let's move this so you can see the ears. I'm just going to do sort of an overall layer of that pink color. Again, I don't want a whole lot of detail in the ears, just because there's so much. And at least in my reference photo, the tip of the ear gets really fuzzy. Like I can't even really see where the ear ends. So I'm just going to come in with a layer of that pink and just sort of let the colors move around sort of how they would naturally. I'm not really going to force anything. I just want a pink tint up there just because the insides of a dog's ear tend to be a little bit more pink than the color of the fur. And because the ears are getting some of that direct sunlight, I'm leaving sort of a white ridge around this whole ear and then a little bit of white on this side where my light source is. So on the opposite side of that ear, I'm just going to fill in with a little bit more color So there's less highlight on this side, but there's still a little bit of highlight. Ear skin, at least on a dog like this, ear skin is so thin that your light source is just gonna like go right through it. So I want both ears, both sides of both ears to have a little bit of that highlight. All right. So while I want to put another coat or another layer of color on the nose and the eyes. So while I'm waiting for those to dry, I'm going to put a bit more yellow into the skin tone or the fur tone that I used. I'm going to use this color, this sort of goldish yellow color, sort of fill in the dog tag here. And I'm going to leave, just like I did with the ears, I'm going to leave sort of a teeny tiny white outline around this shape. Because I imagine it's a little bit shiny material. So I want to have that little highlight to show that it's reflecting that light source. I'm also sort of, now that I'm looking more at that section, it looks like there's another dog tag behind the one that's sort of shaped like a house. So I'm actually gonna come in with a much smaller, I have a size 0 paintbrush here. So I'm gonna mix up sort of a darker purple. And I'm just going to come in behind, ideally I would have done this before, but I'm going to come in behind that house. And it just looks like it's a round tag. So I'm going to show just a slight indication that there's a tag behind the house-shaped one. And again, I'm using my smallest paintbrush here so that I don't mess up that house shape that's already there. All right. So last thing I want to do before, I need to let this dry some more before I come back with a couple more layers on the nose and eyes. But what I will do before I do that is I'm going to come in and I'm going to fill in the highlights on the blanket here just so that those areas will be pushed back a little bit. They're still going to read as highlights just because it's lighter than the folds around it. But they're not going to read as super bright, which we don't want. Again, we want the focus to be on the dog's face. So everything around it can't have the same amount of contrast. So there, we've sort of dulled down the highlights a little bit so that our focus is up here. All right, so I'm going to let this dry for a little bit, and then come back and do the finishing touches. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do here is with that same gray color that I made before, that sort of mix of burnt umber, red, blue, maybe a little bit of green. I'm going to use this gray to really put in some really small details with my size 0 paintbrush. We have some little whiskers sort of coming off the side of our dog's face. Some little indications of fur, like around the eyes. I just want to do, like I said, just indications of fur. We're not going to make this texture all over his body. Just where those hairs, maybe white hairs on top of sort of darker skin. Just to show that we've got a little furry portrait here. And most of this hair I find is just sort of where the sort of shadows are, like right under the eye here. Definitely the corners of the eyes. The quote unquote like little eyebrows. They even have some eyelashes. So I'm just going to use this gray color to just sort of show indications of hair in very select areas, not everywhere. You can even come back with clear water to sort of like blend in those hairs just a tad so that they're not sort of in your face. But I have some sort of whiskers on the mouth here, around the eyes. And again, because this is where you want your focus to be, this is where all those sort of finer details are going to go. But I'm also going to use that gray to sort of reinforce the sort of metal work down here that his tags are hanging from. Maybe I'm going to make the sort of gold color of this tag just a little bit, bring it down just a little bit just so that it's not as bright, again, because we want our focus up here. I'm going to fill that in a little bit. You can come into the ears with this gray color and sort of help show off that there's a lot of hair in here. Again, not a lot, just little indications, like little whispers of some hair in here. All right, and for me, that's pretty finished. I feel like if I keep going, I might mess something up. Maybe, well, now that I'm looking at it, maybe I want a little bit of gray down here just to make that shadow a little bit darker where the body is really laying on top of this blanket. All right, so yeah, that's it. I'm going to sign this. I'm going to dry it. I'm going to spray coat so that it's all protected. Obviously, if you're working with watercolor, you have to spray it before you send it out. Otherwise, any moisture that touches this guy is going to ruin it. So I even do a spray coat on the front and the back of the painting, just so that water can't permeate from either side. So yeah, I'm gonna sign this and send it off. And at the very end, you know, in the next 5 seconds, I'll post a scanned version of this and sort of zoom in on it so that you can really see all the detail in the face. Thank you guys so much for watching this. I'm gonna do a couple more dog portraits because I got a couple more commissions to do that. So wait for that. I got cats coming up. I've got a bunch of stuff coming up. So stay tuned.